The Path to Salvation, a Manual of Spiritual Transformation by St. Theophan the Recluse. Translated by Father Seraphim Rose in the St. Herman of Alaska Brotherhood. Preface. Bishop Theophan the Recluse of Visha. A short biography by E. Sumarokov. Bishop Theophan belongs to an immense significance in the history of the moral development of Russian society. That thirst for complete union with God which led him into reclusion did not deprive the world and his own people of his help. Even from his remote reclusion, he was a great public figure, supporting and directing thousands of people and their spiritual life. Acquiring great spiritual experience by means of complete self-renunciation and strict daily asceticism, Bishop Theophan generously shared with all who had need of it the treasures of his spiritual experience. No one who appealed to him in writing was denied advice, but he exerted a much wider influence by means of his books. How to Live a Christian Life, how, amidst the slew of temptations, misfortunes, weaknesses, and weight of our sinful habits, not to fall into despair, how to desire salvation for oneself and begin the work of moral perfection, how to do battle on this path step by step, and to enter ever more deeply into the saving enclosure of the Church. It is of this that the books of Bishop Theophan speak. Behind all the spiritual wisdom that is expressed in his books stands the pure image of a great ascetic. Every word of Bishop Theophan produces all the stronger an impression for having been imprinted by his life. When he repeats, "Do not gravitate to the earth, all is corruptible. Only the happiness beyond the grave is eternal, unchanging, true, and this happiness depends upon how we spend this life of ours." Then, as a living example of this correct view of the world and the destiny of the soul, stand his own self-denial, his reclusion, his desire to take nothing from life but a striving toward God. Bishop Theophan was called in the world George Vasilyevich Govorov, and he was born on January 10th, 1815, in a village near Orel, where his father was a priest. Thus, from his first impressions of his youth, he lived with the Church. He studied first in the theological preparatory school in the city of Livin, then in the Orel Seminary. From 1837 to 41, he continued his education in the Kiev Theological Academy. Even before finishing the course, he was tonsured a monk. After his tonsure, Theophan, together with the newly tonsured monks, went off to the Kiev caves Lavra, to the well-known Father Partheny. The starets told them, "You, learned monks, who have taken various rules upon yourselves, remember that one thing is most necessary of all, to pray, and to pray unceasingly in your mind and heart to God." Having finished the course with a master's degree, Hieromonk Theophan was assigned a temporary rector of the Kiev Sophia Theological School. Later, he was rector of the Novgorod Seminary and a professor and aide to the supervisor in the Petersburg Theological Academy. This purely scholarly work did not satisfy him, and he petitioned to be discharged from academic service. He was assigned as a member of the Russian mission in Jerusalem. Then, raised to the rank of archimandrite, he was assigned as a rector to the Olonets Seminary. He was soon transferred to Constantinople as chief priest of the Embassy Church, and called to Petersburg to be a rector of the Theological Academy and supervisor of religious instruction in the secular schools of the capital. On May 9th, 1859, he was consecrated bishop for Tambov. Here he established a diocesan school for girls. During his stay in the Tambov See, Bishop Theophan came to love the isolated Visha hermitage. In the summer of 1863, he was transferred to Vladimir, where he served for 3 years. Here, too, he opened a diocesan school for girls. He served in church often, traveled much throughout the diocese, preached constantly, restored churches, and wholeheartedly lived with his flock, sharing with them both joy and sorrow. In 1861, Bishop Theophan was present at the opening of the relics of St. Tikhon of Gdansk. This event must have produced a very strong impression on him, since he had so much in common with St. Tikhon. He had so loved St. Tikhon from his very childhood. He had always thought of him with such enthusiasm that when the time came for the canonization of this great teacher and protector of the people, Bishop Theophan's joy was inexpressible. In 1866, Bishop Theophan petitioned to be relieved as Bishop of Vladimir and was appointed the head of the Visha Hermitage. And soon, at a new petition of his, he was freed even of this duty. What reasons induced Bishop Theophan, full of strength, to leave his diocese and retire into solitude? Various are the characters and gifts of men. It was difficult for him in the midst of the world, and those demands to which one must yield as a consequence of human corruption. His unlimited goodness of heart, a meekness like that of a dove, his trust of people and indulgence of them, all this indicated that it was not for him to live amidst the irreconcilable quarrels of the vain worldly life. His trust could be abused. He could never give necessary reprimands. Besides this, he felt the call to devote all his energies to spiritual writing. As for himself personally, he wished to give up all his thoughts to God alone, whom he loved so absolutely. He desired that nothing might disturb the complete communion with God that was so dear to him, and he left the world to be alone with God. There was an example that he kept constantly before his eyes, St. Tikhon, to whom he had been so drawn from his youth, and who also, leaving one diocese, became a spiritual benefactor of the whole Russian people. On Sunday, July 2nd, 1866, the bishop bade farewell to his flock. After serving the liturgy, the bishop gave his last sermon amidst a death-like silence, in which could be heard only an occasional quiet weeping, and there began 28 years of a solitary, full life of uninterrupted labors. The first 6 years the bishop went to all services and to the early liturgy. In church he stood without moving, without leaning, with his eyes closed so as not to be distracted. On feast days he usually officiated. Beginning in 1872, however, he discontinued all intercourse with people except for the chief priest and his confessor. He went no longer to the monastery church, but built his own, with his own hands, in his chambers, a small church dedicated to the baptism of the Lord. For the first 10 years he served the liturgy in this church every Sunday and feast day, and for the next 11 years every day. He served completely alone, sometimes in silence, but sometimes singing. He seemed to be no longer a man, but an angel with childlike meekness and gentleness. When people came to him on business, he said what was necessary and plunged back into prayer. He ate only enough so as not to ruin his health. Everything that he received he sent by mail to the poor, leaving himself only enough to buy necessary books. From his publications, which were quickly distributed, he received nothing, hoping only that they might be sold as cheaply as possible. In the rare moments when he was free from prayer, reading, or writing, he occupied himself with manual labor. He painted excellent icons and was skilled in wood carving and the locksmith's trade. Every day Bishop Theophan received from 20 to 40 letters, and he answered them all. With extraordinary sensitivity he penetrated to the spiritual situation of the writer and warmly, clearly, and in detail replied to this confession of a distressed soul. His letters, which appeared in print after his death, strike one by their freshness, sensitivity, depth, and boldness of feeling, simplicity, warm concern, cordiality. And thus he lived, directing from his reclusion believers who came to him from afar, thirsting for salvation. The life of Bishop Theophan passed unseen by the world, and death too came to him in solitude. In his last years his vision began to fail, but he did not abandon his constant work, continuing to portion his time in the same strict fashion as always. Evenings his cell attendant prepared everything for the celebration of the liturgy. After the liturgy the bishop asked for tea by a knock on the wall. At 1 o'clock he ate, on non-fast days an egg and a glass of milk. At 4 o'clock he had tea, and after that no more food for the day. Beginning January 1st, 1891, there were several irregularities in his schedule. On January 9th, at 4:30 in the afternoon, his cell attendant, noting the bishop's weakness during these days, although he nonetheless continued to write after noon, looked into his room. The bishop lay on the bed lifeless. His left arm rested on his breast, and his right arm was folded as if for a bishop's blessing. For 3 days the body remained in the small church in his cell, and for 3 days it was in the cathedral, and there was no corruption. When he was vested in his bishop's vestments, the face of the dead man was brightened by a joyful smile. Bishop Theophan died at the age of 79. He was buried in the unheated Kazan Cathedral. In Bishop Theophan's cell, everything was extremely simple, even meager. The walls were bare, the furniture old, a cupboard worth a ruble, a 2-ruble chest, an old table, an old reading stand, an iron folding bed, sofas of birch wood with hard seats. There was a trunk with instruments for lathe work, carpentry, book binding, photographic equipment, a bench for sawing, a joiner's bench. There was a gray cotton undercassock, a wooden panagia, a wooden pectoral cross, a telescope, a microscope, an anatomical and geographical atlas. And then the books without number, without end, in Russian, Slavonic, Greek, French, German, and English. In addition, there were an immense number of icons, a picture of St. Seraphim of Sarov, and many icons painted by the bishop himself. The great hierarch is hidden from us in body, but his spirit lives in the divinely wise printed works which he left. In the person of Bishop Theophan, as Archbishop Nicander of Vilna has said, we have a universal Christian teacher, even though he did not speak, a public figure, though in reclusion, a preacher of the church who was heard everywhere, even though in his last years he appeared in no church see, a missionary convictor of sectarian errors, even though he did not step out into the field that was open to missionary activity, a bright lamp of Christ's teaching for orthodox people, even though he concealed himself from the people's gaze, possessing scarcely a sufficiency of earthly goods, yet enriching all with the spiritual wealth of his teaching, seeking no temporal earthly glory, yet glorified now both by people and by theological science, as well as by various institutions. Introduction. It is possible to describe the feelings and inclinations which a Christian must have, but this is very far from being all that is demanded for the ordering of one's salvation. The important thing for us is a real life in the Spirit of Christ. But just touch on this, and how many perplexities are uncovered, how many guideposts are necessary, as a result, at almost every step. True, one may know man's final goal, communion with God, and one may describe the path to it, faith, and walking in the commandments, with the aid of divine grace. One need only say in addition, here is the path, start walking. This is easily said, but how do we do it? For the most part, the very desire to walk is lacking. The soul, attracted by some passion or other, stubbornly repulses every compelling force and every call. The eyes turn away from God and do not want to look at him. The law of Christ is not to one's liking. There is no disposition even to listen to it. One may ask, how does one reach the point where the desire is born to walk toward God on the path of Christ? What does one do so that the law will imprint itself on the heart? And man, acting according to the law, will act as if from himself, unconstrained, so that this law will not lie on him, but will, as it were, proceed from him? But suppose someone has turned toward God. Suppose he has come to love his law. Is the very going toward God, the very walking on the path of Christ's law, already necessary, and will it be successful merely because we desire it to be? No. Besides that desire, one must also have the strength and knowledge to act. One must have active wisdom. Whoever enters on the true path of pleasing God, or who begins with the aid of grace to strive toward God on the path of Christ's law, will inevitably be threatened by the danger of losing his way at the crossroads, or going astray and perishing, imagining himself saved. These crossroads are unavoidable, because of the sinful inclinations and disorder of one's faculties, which are capable of presenting things in a false light, to deceive and destroy a man. To this is joined the flattery of Satan, who is reluctant to be separated from his victims, and when someone from his domain goes to the light of Christ, pursues him and sets every manner of net in order to catch him again, and quite often he indeed catches him. Consequently, it is necessary for someone who already has the desire to walk on the indicated path of the Lord to be shown, in addition, all the deviations that are possible on this path, so that the traveler may be warned in advance about this, may see the dangers that are to be encountered, and may know how to avoid them. These general considerations, which are unavoidable to all in the path of salvation, render indispensable certain guiding rules of the Christian life, by which it should be determined how to attain to the saving desire for communion with God and the zeal to remain in it, and how to reach God without misfortune amidst all the crossroads that may be met on this path at every step. In other words, how to begin to live the Christian life, and how, having begun, to perfect oneself in it. The sowing and development of the Christian life are different in essence from the sowing and development of natural life, owing to the special character of Christian life in its relation to our nature. A man is not born a Christian, but becomes such after birth. The seed of Christ falls on the soil of a heart that is already beating. Since the naturally born man is injured and opposed by the demand of Christianity, while in a plant, for example, the beginning of life is the stirring of the sprout in the seed, an awakening of, as it were, dormant powers. The beginning of a true Christian life in a man is a kind of recreation, an endowing of new powers, of new life. Further, suppose that Christianity is received as a law, i.e., the resolution is made to live a Christian life. This seed of life, this resolution, is not surrounded in a man by elements favorable to him. And besides this, the whole man, his body and soul, remain unadapted to this new life, unsubmissive to the yoke of Christ. Therefore, from this moment begins in a man a labor of sweat, a labor to educate his whole self, all his faculties, according to the Christian standard. This is why, while growth in plants, for example, is a gradual development of faculties, easy, unconstrained in a Christian, it is a battle with oneself involving much labor, intense and sorrowful, and he must dispose his faculties for something for which they have no inclination. Like a soldier, he must take every step of land, even his own, from his enemies by means of warfare, with the double-edged sword of forcing himself and opposing himself. Finally, after long labors and exertions, the Christian principles appear victorious, reigning without opposition. They penetrate the whole composition of human nature, dislodging from it demands and inclinations hostile to themselves, and place it in a state of passionlessness and purity, making it worthy of the blessedness of the pure in heart, to see God in themselves in sincerest communion with Him. Such is the place in us of the Christian life. This life has 3 stages, which may be called 1. Turning to God, 2. Purification or self-amendment, and 3. Sanctification. In the first stage, a man turns from darkness to light, from the domain of Satan to God. In the second, he cleanses the chamber of his heart from every impurity, in order to receive Christ the Lord who is coming to him. In the third, the Lord comes, takes up his abode in his heart, and communes with him. This is the state of blessed communion with God, the goal of all labors and ascetic endeavors. To describe all this and determine its laws will mean to indicate the path to salvation. Complete guidance in this manner takes a man standing on the crossroads of sin, leads him along the fiery path of purification, and leads him up to the degree of perfection attainable to him according to his level of maturity in Christ. Thus, it should show 1. How Christian life begins in us, 2. How it is perfected, ripened, and strengthened, and 3. How it manifests itself in its perfection. End of introduction. Thank you for listening, and have a blessed day.